All right, this is a short lecture on President Theodore Roosevelt, who, if it wasn't for his fifth cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, would probably be a lot more famous in American culture. But Teddy Roosevelt is actually a fascinating person and a really important president to be aware of, mostly because he had an incredibly forceful personality. So, Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt, was born on October 27th, 1858 in basically New York City. He was always known as Teddy. As a boy, it's really kind of interesting. He was really not in the best of health. He was thought of as frail and sickly. And so what he did was, especially throughout his teenage years, is he followed a really regimented program of gymnastics and weightlifting to build up his strength and sort of make him into the Teddy Roosevelt manly man that we all think of today when we think of President Theodore Roosevelt. He went to Harvard College and graduated from Harvard in 1880, and then married his wife, Alice Hathaway Lee, and graduated from Columbia Law School. He was then elected to the New York State Assembly at only the age of 23. And that's one of the interesting things about Theodore Roosevelt is he really bucks the trend in terms of politicians and especially United States presidents because he's much younger than a lot of the other presidents who we've talked about in the past. Now, sadly, both his wife and his mother actually die on the exact same day in 1884. And so Roosevelt leaves the New York area and he spends 2 years, really from 1884 to 1886, on a ranch that he owns in the Dakota Territory because North and South Dakota aren't states yet. And this is where, again, he starts to build up this mystique as this almost cowboy like figure. He's hunting big game, he's driving cattle. At one point, Teddy Roosevelt is actually working as a sheriff on the frontier. And he does this for about 2 years. And then, upon returning from New York, he actually gets married again, this time to his childhood sweetheart, whose name is Edith Kermit Caro. So, in 1886, Roosevelt runs unsuccessfully this time for mayor of New York City. But 2 years later, because he continues to work in the Republican Party, Roosevelt gets rewarded by then President Benjamin Harrison, who rewards Roosevelt's service with a job on the United States Civil Service Commission. So these are essentially cushy jobs that allow individuals to get a paycheck and to ingratiate themselves further with members of their own political party. But the most interesting thing happens in the outbreak of the Spanish American War in 1898. At this point, he was naval secretary, and Roosevelt left this position at the outbreak of hostilities to join what was called the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, what was really known as the Rough Riders. This is a group of men who volunteered to go to Cuba and fight for, I guess, quote unquote, Cuban independence, really more or less to fight against Spain in an effort to try to get Spain out of one of its last American area holdings. Once in Cuba, Roosevelt actually led the Rough Riders. He was extremely brave, and he led a charge up a hill, excuse me, in what was called the Battle of San Juan. There are some really fascinating images. One of them is on the screen right now. And these images of Roosevelt in the front line, and Roosevelt with the cowboy style hat, shooting a pistol, riding a horse, these are all over the United States newspapers. So when he comes back from the war, he returns as one of America's most visible heroes. And he's going to use that public cachet in order to move himself up the political ladder even more. Now, once he's back, Teddy Roosevelt shows how he can be a really important figure in American history, but he is one of his character traits is he's extremely stubborn. And so Roosevelt is elected the governor of New York. And when he's elected the governor of New York as a Republican, the expectation is he's going to serve the Republican Party machine. But Teddy Roosevelt doesn't serve anybody. And so in the end, he ends up butting heads with the Republican establishment so much that they decide that they need to figure out a way to get him out of New York. And the way they do that is they decide they're going to move him to the national ticket. So instead, Teddy Roosevelt gets named President McKinley's running mate for the election of 1900. President McKinley wins, and actually, Roosevelt campaigned vigorously for McKinley. He traveled more than 21,000 miles, spoke in more than 24 states. And as a result of this, McKinley and Roosevelt won in a landslide in 1900. But President McKinley served for a very short period of time because on September 6th, 1901, a deranged anarchist named Leon Slogos shot McKinley at the Pan America Exposition in Buffalo, New York. McKinley died 8 days later, and Roosevelt was sworn in as the 26th President of the United States. Roosevelt was only 42 years old when he took office, at that point, the youngest president in the nation's history. And he very much used his youth and vigor and energy and strength to transform the public image of what it meant to be the president. So Roosevelt had a couple of different domestic plans. So plans for things that he wanted to do within the United States. First of all, he had what he called the Square Deal. The Square Deal was a domestic program. It included a promise to battle large industrial combinations or trusts. In other words, he wanted to help the common person, and especially certain trade unions, stand up to the people that we've talked about already in class. I'm talking about those robber barons or those captains of industry, the people who are definitely opposed to things like an 8-hour workday and fair wages. So the problem is now this threatens to restrain trade, but at the same time would also make industry and the growth of the American economy more of a shared enterprise for everybody in the nation. He doesn't necessarily pass any new laws to get this done. What Roosevelt does is uses the Sherman Antitrust Act. So there's an act that says that you cannot have large trusts. Again, a trust is when one company essentially creates a shell so that it can own and operate another company. It's a way to get around the prohibition against monopolies. What Roosevelt does is he resurrects the Sherman Antitrust Act and he decides, I'm going to use it and I'm going to use it vigorously. And at first, he brings an action against the Northern Securities Company, which is actually a railroad. And it's a railroad founded by a couple of captains of industry that we talked about. James Hill, J.P. Morgan's involved in that. And that same year, he intervenes in a prolonged coal strike in Pennsylvania, using a combination of negotiation tactics to halt the strike. And this ends up getting a modest pay increase for the miners. So it's one of the first times that a president has chosen to intervene in a labor dispute on the side of organized labor. So Roosevelt, as a result of this, becomes known as the trust buster. He is this person who is willing to stand up for the small man, the common man, in order to accomplish his objectives. But the thing that Roosevelt is probably most known for today is conservation. In June of 1901, he is able to get past the National Reclamation Act, which is dedicated to large-scale irrigation projects in the American West. This is really his first legislative achievement. But in addition to all of this, Roosevelt, through the federal agencies, sets aside almost 200 million acres. That's 5 times as much land as every other president from Washington to McKinley combined. And he sets this land aside for public use. Roosevelt's kind of famous in saying that the United States doesn't have some of the artistic accomplishments of old world Europe. There's no Mona Lisa in the United States. There's no great ruins of Rome. There's no echoes of the Western past here. What we have is the splendid natural beauty of this continent. And Roosevelt, because he was so committed to things like hunting and hiking and camping, he also goes out of his way to make sure that this land is set aside for things like national forests. This is how we get Yosemite National Park, for example, and wildlife refuges. Now, as part of this process, there's a give and a take with everything. Roosevelt favors the removal of many Native Americans who happen to be on this land. And so, part of that 200 million acres, about 86 million acres of the land that Roosevelt sets aside, so almost half, was tribal land, which gets transferred to the national forest system. So today we can look back on Roosevelt and his conservation efforts as a very positive thing, but we have to remember that those positive accomplishments were built on the back of individuals who didn't necessarily have the power to object at that moment. Now, let's talk about foreign policy and foreign affairs. Like McKinley, Roosevelt sought to bring the United States out of its isolationism, and he thought fulfill its God-given responsibility as a world power. He's famous for saying that America should, quote, speak softly and carry a big stick. So in the realm of international affairs, that the president needs to be willing to use force to back up diplomatic negotiations. He followed this most conspicuously in any of his dealings with the emerging state in Latin America. So think Central and South America. For example, in 1903, he helped Panama secede from Colombia because Panama had been a part of Colombia. And he did this with the goal of facilitating a construction of a canal, later known as the Panama Canal. So, up until President Roosevelt, if a United States naval vessel needed to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, it had to go all the way around South America. Strategically, this isn't a good idea, nor is it a good idea for business. So, under Roosevelt, we see the construction of the Panama Canal, which dramatically shortens the time that it takes for a ship to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific because it can now cut through Panama straight through the canal. A couple of years later, several European nations attempt to forcibly collect debts that are owed to them by Latin American nations. Roosevelt opposes this. Now, you may remember from last semester, we talked about this thing called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was the idea that the United States was declaring North and South America free from European colonialism. Roosevelt takes this one step further, issuing what he calls the Roosevelt Corollary. And this is to the Monroe Doctrine. So this is kind of think of it like an add-on, right? So this gets tacked onto the Monroe Doctrine. And what this says is not only are the Americas closed to European colonialism, but the Americas are closed to European intervention, period. What this means is the United States wasn't going to allow any European nations to intervene in any way in North or South America unless the United States agreed, which in this case, Roosevelt didn't. And he announced that the United States would bar foreign intervention in Latin America in an effort to collect their debts. Now, to prepare the United States for an expanded role on the world stage, Roosevelt sought to build up the country's defenses. And by the end of his presidency, he had transformed the United States Navy into a major international force at sea. Outside the Western Hemisphere, he also led negotiations to end the Russo-Japanese War, which took place from 1904 to 1905. And because of that, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905. He also reached an agreement with Japan that traded diplomatic recognition of that country in exchange for Japan's acceptance of the ongoing United States presence in the Philippines. This will go on as sort of a hunky-dory, happy relationship until December 7th, 1941. But that's a story for another day. As the 1908 election approached, Roosevelt prepared begrudgingly to fulfill a campaign pledge that he had made in 1904, not to seek another term. Remember, he was technically only elected once because he took over from McKinley only 1 year into his term. So he's a 7 year president. He's not an 8 year president. It's a little bit different. So he throws his support in the election of 1908 behind Secretary of War William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft is successful and wins the presidency. So immediately after leaving office in early 1909, Roosevelt left for a 10-month African safari, and there's an image of that up on the screen right now. And he just kind of got a lot of international praise for this. This also, again, builds into this idea of Roosevelt as the rugged outdoorsman, as the American sort of cowboy figure. But when he gets back from Africa, it doesn't take long for Teddy Roosevelt to get really ticked off with William Howard Taft. Roosevelt found, at least believed in his mind, that President Taft had not followed through with any promised programs of progressive reforms. Instead, he consistently sided with the more conservative wing of the Republican Party, and this made Teddy Roosevelt angry. Angry, Teddy Roosevelt decides that he is going to campaign against his successor for the Republican nomination in 1912. That doesn't work. The Republican Party sticks with Taft over Roosevelt. As a result, he and his party supporters leave the Republican Party and form the Progressive Party, otherwise known as the Bull Moose Party. Why? This has to do with a statement that Roosevelt once made. He referred to himself in a letter as being as strong as a bull moose. And actually, he kind of was, because while campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Roosevelt was actually shot in the chest by a fanatic. Not only did he recover from being shot in the chest, but he didn't pause. After being shot in the chest, he dusted himself off, continued to the stage, and delivered an approximately 1 hour speech before seeking medical attention. None of this works in his favor in the election of 1912. The Republican Party is split. About half of them vote for Teddy Roosevelt in the Bull Moose Party, and half of them vote for Taft in the Republican Party. Democrat Woodrow Wilson takes the White House, winning 435 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 88. Taft only gets 8. Despite the loss, Roosevelt's run actually marks the most successful third-party effort in American history, and many of his progressive ideas would actually be accomplished by Woodrow Wilson over the next 8 years. So for all those reasons, Teddy Roosevelt really is one of the most important political figures and presidents in United States history.